You ever wish you could assume someone else's identity? If there were someone, past or present, that you would switch places with, who would it be? I actually know, the movie was Trading Places. Somebody wanted to be his dad and that. What if it were somebody famous or powerful or wealthy? I'm sure you thought about that in your life. If only I could be that person, my life would be wonderful. Wouldn't it be great? And I could impact the world. You might even be thinking about somebody like that right now. And have you ever thought about that? I would. So Stan, you want to go to the kids' church, or are you going to sit with us? We just started, so it's up to you.
Can we go to Sunday school? Yeah.
Debbie's ready to take it.
I have two cards. Oh.
See you in a little bit.
I call the green one the adventure one. Yeah, this is the white one. It has another one.
So wouldn't it be great if you could assume somebody else's identity and impact the world? You said, wouldn't that be wonderful? And I've thought about that at times, and many times I sat right where you folks are, and I said, if only I was the pastor, things would be different. Pretty vain, isn't it? Seriously, how could anybody want to be somebody other than who you really are? Well, I can tell you such a person. His name was called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The Apostle John calls him the Word. We see that in verse 1, and we see it again in verse 14. It says the beginning was the Word in verse 1. And in verse 14 we see the Word became flesh. The word word in Greek actually means logic or reasoning, rationale. In other words, logic was from the beginning. And who in the right mind, who is eternal, existent, knowing all things and all powerful, who in the right mind would want to become human? If you had created the world and all things in it, why would you want to become one of us? John's making that case that Jesus did that. Because he wanted not just to bring light to the world, but light into darkness in the present world, so that they'd have a chance to see God in the flesh. No one was able, up until this point, to see the fullness of God's glory. Yeah, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve got to fellowship with the Father. They got to talk to him every night. And we don't know how close the encounter was, but it wasn't when they could actually see him in his fullness. They couldn't fully see him. And after the fall, things got worse, didn't they? Even Moses wasn't permitted to see God's face. And we hear about this in the book of Exodus. So I'm going to flip over to Exodus, where it talks about this. And this was a very dark time in Israel's history. We're going to get back to the Gospel of John. But in Exodus 33, we see a time in Israel's history that's not going really well. It's dark. Moses was up on Mount Sinai, receiving the commands of the Lord, and it's been a long time, 40 days. And they were wondering where Moses was. Maybe he's abandoned us. Maybe he's forgotten about us. So what did they do? They decided to make themselves a golden calf and claim the golden calf that delivered them from Egypt. Not only that, but they had a drunken orgy where people were running around naked, violating the very laws that God was giving Moses in the mountain. And God was furious with them. And he wanted to annihilate people and start all over with Moses. That's the setting of what happens here in Exodus 33. We're going to start at verse 7. So Moses wants to hear from God. So it says, Moses used to make a tent and pitch it outside the camp, some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Everyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrance to their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come and stay at the entrance while the Lord spoke to Moses. So that pillar of cloud was the representation, physical representation of God being there. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, they stood and worshipped, each at the entrance to his tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. Then Moses would return to the camp. So there was a place that they set aside you would go to talk to God. The tent of the meeting was a special place. And there was a worship that only Moses would go into. There was a bigger place called the tabernacle that was constructed. And that had a place where they could worship and offer sacrifices. The Levites would administer that. But most people didn't have access to God. Just the Levites, or in this case, Moses. Moses wants more than just to hear from God. He wants to see God. So if you go to verse 12, Moses says to the people, Lord, you've been telling me, lead these people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. You said, I know you by name and have found favor in me. If I have found favor in your eyes, teach me your ways to continue that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember this, that this nation is your people. The Lord said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. So that's not enough. Yeah, I'm going to go with you. So at this point, Moses wasn't convinced that God hadn't abandoned Israel. He wanted reassurance. So he says, in verse 18, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. And that principle, no one can see God's face and live, existed from Adam and Eve until this moment when Jesus came to earth. This is why it's so significant that in the book of John, he uses the word tabernacle. And our focus primarily is on verse 14 of John 1, where he says, the Word became flesh and lived, or tabernacled. I know he has it all wrong. It's tabernacled. He tabernacled with us for a while. And we seen his glory and the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. See, even back in the Old Testament, with the tabernacle was finished. And you see that in Exodus 40. And I'm not going to read it out loud, but you can look at it, Exodus 40, 34, 35. It says, when the tabernacle was completed, God entered the tabernacle and shone so brightly that no one, not even Moses, could go inside it. The fullness of God's glory could not be seen. It was too radiant. It was too judgmental, in a sense. People were afraid of the light at that particular point because the light brought judgment. Until Jesus arrived as a human being, no one had seen the fullness of God. But that changes in John 14. What Jesus entered the tent of humanity so that all would have an opportunity to see the glory of God. That's why he became flesh. He wanted us, people, and particularly the generation of John, he wanted those people to see the fullness of God in the flesh and to radiate God's glory. That was his motive, to show the light of God's glory and to take residence in those who would receive him. Notice in verse 12 it says, "Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." We must let him come completely into our tent. Now think about the tent that you have. Maybe you don't live in a tent. How many here live in a tent? Maybe you live in a home. Did you know your home is just a temporary structure? We all are just wanderers. We're vagabonds here on planet Earth. We're just temporary residents. Whatever we call a residence could be a dwelling place or a tabernacle. It's a tent. Do you have a secret part of your tent, figuratively speaking, your life? Do you have something secret that you'd rather not show outsiders? It might be a part of your house. You said, well, we close that door, we don't let company see that. Guilty, right? What about your life? Is it the same way? Now, how ironic it would be if Jesus was your guest to your home. You said, Jesus, you can't see that. We have that one blocked off. How vain for us to think, the one who created the world doesn't already know about that secret. He knows. And he knows about it. You want to keep those places in darkness? Jesus is the light of the world. He came to expose the darkness, but for those who are his children, he wants to help straighten up the mess you've made. We can't show that room to company. It's a mess. Jesus, I know it's a mess. That's why I'm here. I want to come in and help you clean up your mess. That's why Jesus came in the flesh, to clean up the mess we've made of our lives. That's why he came. You may not feel like you're ready for company, but Jesus wants to help you clean up your mess. He came into the world to straighten up the mess that humans have made of it. Now, can you imagine that? The one who created world, as we talked about last week, and everything in it, including humans, decides to become a human when they mess up his creation. You made a mess of my home, and I'm going to come anyway and help fix it for you. That's amazing. That the Word could do that. The Word could become flesh like that. I'm going to use a couple of words that you might hear in the construction industry. Demolition and renovation. That was what Jesus came to do. He came to bring an eternal contract of demolition and renovation. Demolition of the darkness that exists in your life, evilness, and renovation of life, living the way God wants. So allow Jesus to come in and do the demolition that needs to be done and the renovation that needs to be done. So we could just stop right there, but there's more. Now this slide is not for everyone, and I kind of highlighted this last week, but I wanted to go back to verse 9. Verse 9 is one of those verses that in the New Testament is hard to interpret, and there's at least three distinct views on what it will mean, and I kind of like the one the best. I don't know if the NIV has it right, but the true light that gives light to every man is coming into the world. So there's this, you see the word every man? That's what throws people off. When they see every or all, they think it means everybody. And no, it doesn't mean that. Let's say you were at a party, and they said, well, how many people were there? Well, everybody was there. Everybody in town was there. Did you take a roster? Did you do a list? No, you just saw the crowd. It was an abundance. It was a multitude of people. So you said everyone was there. Everyone had the opportunity to go. Everyone was invited, so I assume everyone was there. I think that's exactly how John's using this word. It gave a light to everyone. Everyone had the opportunity to see the light. Not everyone received the light, but it was shining in such a way that it was available to be seen. Every single person could see it. Now some religions get this idea that God saves everyone. Jesus came to the world to straighten our mess, and he does that for everyone, no matter what. Because all doesn't mean all. Remember back in Matthew 3, when John the Baptist was baptizing people, Matthew says that all of Judea and all of Samaria came to be baptized. I'm sure it wasn't every single person. But if you read a little farther in that story, John says, why are you here? To a few. Go get your life straight before you become baptized. So they didn't even belong. They hadn't received. There were fake converts even back then. Now, Jesus' arrival did show God's glory to that generation that John's talking about, the one that he lived in while he was on earth. And in later chapters, this is just the prologue, this is just the introduction. In later chapters, he's going to share the feelings that people have about Jesus. They're going to be mixed. Some are going to reject him, some are going to rejoice, and some are going to be indifferent. But they all had the opportunity to see the light. You would think that the people that studied Scripture, the Pharisees and Sadducees, would recognize the Creator when he shows up. But most of them didn't. You'd think those that had studied the Scriptures would recognize the Messiah when he finally arrived. But they didn't. He was in the world, verse 10, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. John shows that those people rejected his words and his miracles as being not from God. When we get later into John, we're going to see that. They're going to actually reject him. They rejected Jesus being the Word made flesh to dwell among us. They should have recognized Jesus as the promised Messiah, but they didn't. Others did, however, recognize Jesus and receive him. Verse 12. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God.
Amen.
So those are the folks that were adopted into God's family. John mentions a group that should not have been entitled to receive Jesus Christ according to the culture of that time. Jesus should have been for the elite, the religious leaders, just like it was in the Old Testament with Moses and the Levites. He's going to come to the common folk. And he's going to come to ordinary folks just like us. He came to live as we did among us. He lived as a human. What a humbling thing. The Creator to come to earth, to live as a human, so that he could set things right with us. But not only that, so that he could show what God was like. So we could have a better picture of our Creator in the flesh. And some people need to see things tangible like that. Why did Jesus do that? Because he wanted to. He wanted to. In verse 13, he says, they became children of God not because of natural descent, nor of human decision, or husband's will, but born of God. In essence, no matter what they tried to do, people could not attain to belief. It was God who brought that to them. It was his will. It was his will. In the Old Testament, that see God, they had to reach God. They were unable to do it. They were unable, no matter how high they tried to reach, they could not. His glory filled the temple, and they could not bear that. Jesus had to become human so that we could tabernacle with him. The gap between man and God was too vast for humans to traverse. There was a theologian named McLaren who said this: "What's the use of standing beside a lame man, pointing to a shining summit and saying to him, 'Get up there, and you will breathe a purer atmosphere'? He's lying lame at the foot of it. He may want to ascend up there, but he lacks the power to do so." So since we lack the power to reach God, God descends down to earth and reaches us. This is not a message that's common knowledge. You certainly won't see it on TV. You might see just the opposite. I'm reminded of a Touched by an Angel episode. Sometimes there's good stuff on this, but this one was just really whack. It's called Into the Light. There's this character named James Black who was a really bad guy. I mean, he stole, he embezzled money for his company and things, and he was dying. He had heart problems. And there's this one scene where he's having a heart attack, and he's seeing the light. He's running towards the light, and the more he ran towards the light, the more he's being pulled into the darkness. And he said, I don't want to go into the darkness. And then he realized, he said, I have to do my part. I have to reach up. No, Christ has to come down. No matter how high you reach, you're unable. You're not able. We can do nothing to reach God. Nothing. Jesus came down so that he could tabernacle with us because we could not bridge the gap to him. So now instead of coming in judgment, Jesus comes with grace. And John's talking about this in the prologue, which is kind of interesting because he's going to embellish upon this a lot more in the rest of the gospel. But he wants to get this part of this idea of grace. He's coming to lavish us with grace. Verse 16. From the fullness of grace, his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law has been given through Moses. Grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. Amen. So grace is something that you don't reserve. You don't deserve grace, but it's given in abundance by God. Now, grace upon grace is that's another one that's hard to understand. But it's like putting a layer of icing, whatever your favorite dessert is. You put a top layer on it, and you go, give me some more. So you put another layer on it, give me some more. And you keep putting so much of your favorite flavor on top of your dessert. Then you go, okay, I've had enough. But he won't stop until you've had enough. He can put grace upon grace, layer upon layer of your favorite dessert until you're satiated. That's what he came to do. The law could never bring that satisfaction. The law of Moses brought condemnation. I got to obey those 10 commandments? I can't do that. I make other things idols. I covet. Not to mention the other ones that are a little easier to say you don't do. Right? I guarantee you, every one of you has made something else an idol, and every one of you is coveting. Right? So guilty as charged. So we can't keep the Old Testament law. But Christ, through his perfect obedience, came down to earth to give us the right to become part of his family. I'm going to come down to earth. I'm going to live in perfect obedience that God requires. And then I'm going to be offered that sacrifice once and for all, so that all who believe in me can have an eternal home in heaven. There's your gospel in like 1 minute. Jesus gave us the right to become the part of the family of God, and our effort is to believe it. That's what we are required to do. Believe Jesus was the promised Messiah. Believe that his sacrifice on the cross paid for all your sins. Believe and receive his grace. Stop trying it on your own. Accept Christ's done. Later on, he's going to explain that even the strength to believe is a gift from God. We'll get to that later. But there is more, as the television salesman would say. Jesus came so that we can get a clearer picture of God. He talks about that in verse 18. I reminded of the story of a boy who was drawing a picture. And his pastor came and he saw him drawing a picture. He says, son, what are you drawing a picture of? He says, I'm drawing a picture of God. The pastor says, don't be silly. No one knows what God looks like. The boy says, well, you will when I'm finished. We sometimes think we know what God looks like. We have these pictures in our mind. And, you might even have books that portray Jesus in a certain light, but they're not accurate. Nobody knows what God looks like until Jesus came. He revealed him. Verse 18. No one has ever seen God, but the only Son who is of the Father has made him known. He has revealed him. So There's a lot of meat in that one. Let's see if we can unpack just a few things. His miracles, his words, his life displayed God's glory. There's this really complicated word we hear in seminary called exegete. I don't know if you know what the word exegete means. Well, your exegesis was not correct. It's explanation. So when somebody comes up and they give a message, they're supposed to exegete the passage. They're supposed to explain it. So that's what Jesus did. He came to exegete the Father. He came to explain him. By his life, through his works, through his miracles, he explained the nature of God. That's why Jesus came to earth. Not only to give us salvation, but to give us a clear picture of who God was. Moses did not have that privilege. We do. We are allowed to see God. Those who met Jesus saw him in the flesh. We can see it through the testimony of those who were in the flesh. Now imagine you meet an admired celebrity, you can pick whoever you want, in the flesh, and you're talking to him or her, and they have a conversation with you. I mean, it's one thing to say, I met Richard Karn. It's another thing to say, he and I had a conversation. You know, he's the guy that's Al on, you know, on the Toolman Taylor. And I've actually been in the same room as Richard Karn, but I never met him. But can you imagine coming up to a celebrity and they come to, hey, hi George, how you doing? I heard about, and they know all about your life. They said, hey, can I come over to your house and help you fix that toilet that's all flush? I know you made a mess of it, but I'll come in anyway. So that's kind of pales in comparison to what Jesus did. This celebrity decides to visit you, you get all of it, but Jesus comes to tabernacle with you. Shouldn't that be the most wonderful thing that you can imagine? That Jesus did that, become human, so that you could take a permanent residence in his home. He wants to visit the tent of your life, not just your residence, but he wants to look in your heart. He wants to see the darkness in your heart. He wants to gently expose it and say, you know, you made a mess of it, but I'm here to help. I can help fix that. There's a verse in Revelation that actually speaks to that well. And unfortunately, some people think it's about evangelism, but it's about fellowship. I'm going to read it for you right now. Revelation 3:20. Here I am, Jesus says. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. That's what Jesus desires. He wants to enter into your life and fellowship with you. And he could only do that because he became flesh. He's going to help you clean up the mess that you left in your house. And even more than that, he's going to prepare you to meet God. You know, one of the things in the old tradition was that a groom was supposed to do was get the bride ready for the wedding. Jesus is doing that now. And the longer you live, the more work Jesus is doing in you and your life to get you ready to meet God.